Yo ho ho! So today I'm going to be talking you through all the books that I read over my summer break. I had a pretty productive reading period again, but I unfortunately didn't get to read all the books that were on my summer TBR, so I'm going to be carrying 3 over into my autumn TBR. But let's get into the books that I did read. So the first one was Melmoth The Wanderer by Charles Maturin. So this, I feel like I read this at completely the wrong time of year. I know it's gothic horror. I probably should have known better, but I was kind of so curious about it that I just wanted to get it done. But ultimately I found that it was quite draggy and long-winded, and it took me quite some time to get through it. So it's about a young man who is attending Trinity College, and his uncle is very sick and dying, so he goes back to look after his uncle, and while he's there in this house, he comes across a room that's locked, and eventually he gets into this room and discovers a portrait of a distant relative titled Melmoth, and Melmoth is a really disturbing character, and he captivates the mind of this young man, and he wants to find out more, but unfortunately his uncle just doesn't want to talk about it because of the family history. And then the story of Melmoth starts to unfold. So this is written in 3 parts, and it recounts the story of 3 people who've come into contact with Melmoth. And Melmoth is quite an interesting, captivating character. The fact that he's just very sinister and he's always popping up out of nowhere to try to aid people, but ultimately just wants to help them for his own benefit. I found the 3rd section to be more of a page turner for me. Like, that was the most interesting section because you find out more about Melmoth in a sort of personal way. But it is disturbing to see how manipulative he is and whether people that he comes into contact with recognize that or not. Even the ending is quite, for gothic horror, I was like, I wouldn't expect anything different, but I was kind of unsatisfied by it. It just kind of felt like that's like my only way to describe it. Another thing that I did kind of struggle with was the fact that I've read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde a couple of years ago, which was heavily inspired by Melmoth the Wanderer. So there are certain times where it really crosses over, and there's moments that are exactly the same or just incredibly similar. So if you're like me and you've read The Picture of Dorian Gray, you might struggle with this because it just feels like at times it feels like an extended version of that. So overall I ended up giving it 3 stars. It didn't excite me or captivate me as much as I had hoped it would, but I still enjoyed it nonetheless. And the prose, there was moments of the prose writing that were really, really beautiful, that I thought were very inspiring and just very like delicately written, but overall it didn't blow me away. The next book that I read was Yoko Tawada's The Last Children of Tokyo, and this was just everything I expected it to be. It was so charming and sweet, and I absolutely adored the relationship between the grandfather and grandson. It was just really, I loved it. So this is about an old man who's over 100 years old who lives in Japan named Yoshiro. There has been a global catastrophe which has caused Japan to close their borders, and unfortunately this has caused a lot of pollution, and the newest generations are born very sickly and feeble with a very low life expectancy. So Yoshiro is caring for his young grandson who has been horribly affected by this as well. And what's interesting is that the older generation don't really seem to die off at all. And he has a lot of moments where he questions how long he'll live, and knowing that he's going to outlive his grandson and have to deal with that kind of pain. I thought that the writing of this was just really exquisite. There are some really, really beautiful moments within it. And just like I said, the relationship between the grandfather and grandson was just so, so sweet. And you get really invested in the characters and you sort of start to feel their fear. There were a few different concepts in this that were presented that I thought were quite interesting, and they really were just like touched upon. Like, one of the things that captured my imagination was the fact that the newest generation or the youngest generation don't really have gender in the sense of the fact that they actually will change gender at one time throughout their life, just that's how their bodies are. So it's more so of a unisex generation, which I thought was quite interesting. Another thing is the fact that this is a character-driven dystopian novella, and if you're looking for something that has strong world building, it's not going to be in this. There's a lot of things in this that are really just left to your imagination, which as a reader I really don't mind when authors do that. I can't recommend this enough. I gave it 4 stars. The next book that I read was Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion. So this is the first work of fiction of hers that I've ever read, and honestly it didn't disappoint. It was very much my cup of tea, and even reading it now I was thinking it reminded me a lot of the books that I read when I was a teenager that were based around mental health, and I was thinking like, oh, I wish I'd read this when I was 16 or 17, like back when I was really keen into reading stories with those kind of themes. But nevertheless I did really enjoy it. So this is about a woman named Maria who we meet after she's had a nervous breakdown. Basically, she's recovering in a hospital. Initially, the story starts jumping around from different character perspectives, and then ultimately leads into Maria and her story. And I thought that was quite interesting. And there was moments while reading this that really reminded me of Less Than Zero by Bret Easton Ellis, and I'm assuming that that was heavily inspired by this. And after completing this, I realized there's actually a quote on the back by Bret Easton Ellis, and I'm wondering, is that like an accurate thing to say, or did I see that, not process it, and then like start associating it with it? I don't know. I just thought that was really strange. So this recounts Maria's life as a model and an actress in Hollywood. This really explores her relationship with men, and if you're into character studies based around those kind of themes, I think you'll find this quite interesting. It also talks quite heavily about her life as a mother, and that was probably my favorite aspect of it. Women who are struggling with their mental health, who are also mothers and trying to juggle everything that goes into both of those things, I find fascinating. So that's why I really enjoyed the story. It does have moments where it is, like I said, quite dreary and quite depressing and heavy, and there is a lot of talk about Hollywood and California again. Like, it's Joan Didion, you're not going to be able to escape that, but it fit really well. So I ended up giving this 3 stars. The next book that I read was The Autobiography of Malcolm X, and this was my first 5-star book of the year. This was absolutely incredible, and I can't encourage you enough to pick it up. Reading this was like so eye-opening, but also like I didn't really expect that I would get so attached to his voice. And even knowing how this book was going to end, knowing the history of what happened, I still wasn't prepared for it, and I found myself getting quite emotional at certain points, because towards the end he does say things along the lines of, I know I probably won't live to see the publication of this book. And that ultimately ended up being true. From the very start, we're presented with a huge amount of topics of what it's like growing up as a Black person in America, even down to colorism from your parents. The fact that his father favorited him for being the lightest skinned child, and his mother scolded him for the same reason. You know how people are talking about reading books about educating themselves, or reading books about being anti-racist? I would say to anyone who's looking to learn a bit more, get a bit more well-rounded on the topic, be less ignorant, read this, because this covers so much, and there's so much introspection in this, like Malcolm X talking about his own behaviour and why he was the way he was before he ended up going to prison, and then the transformation of himself as a person after prison, and then later on in his life when he went on his pilgrimage. Like, the pilgrimage section was probably my favourite section, because during a lot of this I was waiting for him to really come into himself, because when he's introduced to Elijah Muhammad, there is a lot of regurgitating Elijah Muhammad's beliefs, and Mr. Muhammad said this and Mr. Muhammad thinks that, and I was just kind of waiting for him to be like, but I think this and I think that, and that did happen, and I was just so pleased. And then you realize, you know, we're getting towards the end of the book, we know what's going to happen. You realize that he had so much left in life that he needed to do. I think this is probably the most thought-provoking book that I've ever read. Reading things, especially reading about experiences that don't match your own, is incredibly important, and putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. So if you are looking to have that kind of experience, like really thought-provoking, you want to get educated, you want to be presented with certain ideas that you may never have thought of previously, you want to read something that's quite introspective, I would absolutely recommend this. So the next book that I picked up was something that I characterized as fun. I was like, I want a light, fun read. So I picked up the Canon Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. My first 1,000+ page novel that I've ever read, and I'm very, very proud of myself. And this is the one book that I talked about in my What I Want to Read in Summer that I really was iffy about. Like, I thought it was going to be really hard to actually get around to reading this, and honestly, it was so much fun. This is the tale of a man who is falsely imprisoned, and I was thinking initially that it was going to be the bulk of this book, that the prison stuff would probably be the first 500 pages. It's actually 200 pages or so. So the first blue thingy here, that's just the prison stuff. Everything else after that is everything else after that. This is the tale of revenge, and it's not the type of revenge that you would typically think about. It's the kind of revenge where it's for the long haul, and he doesn't really care if he's taking his revenge out on your grandchildren. He's gonna have his revenge one way or another. And it was just like, I really feel like this was a perfect novel. I felt like everything that you're presented within it is beneficial towards the story. There is a lot of like side stories that carry on in this, like with other characters, and I was able to get really invested in those like subplots as well, and like that's something that doesn't typically happen a lot. Another thing that made this reading experience extra special is the fact that I started listening to the Skyrim soundtrack while reading it, because there was a lot of words in this that I would characterize as buzzwords that I would associate with Skyrim. There was even like references to vampires and magic and, you know, companions, and there was just a lot of stuff that was going on. I was like, this is making me think of Skyrim, so I want to listen to the Skyrim soundtrack, and it was wonderful. So if you need something to listen to, or if you like listening to music, I would definitely recommend checking that out. Also, it's just a good soundtrack to listen to if you're reading anything kind of old-timey or fantasy related, because it's just, you're able to get a little bit more immersed in the world. So I really recommend reading this. It's not the stereotypical classic in the sense of like it being slow or stuffy. It's quite fast-paced. I feel like it's this kind of story that a lot of people would be able to get into, and it's so much fun. Like, I can't stress that enough. So after reading the Count of Monte Cristo, I was very far behind on my Goodreads challenge, so I decided to read some shorter books. Even though I didn't really stick to that, I ended up going back to the fatties. I decided to read I Dreamed I Was a Very Clean Tramp by Richard Hell. So this has been sitting on my bookshelf for quite some time, and I don't know why I had hesitated so much on picking it up. I think I was just really burnt out on reading music-related memoirs, because it is something that I do love reading about. To be honest, when I did read it, I wasn't really in the mood to read it then. I didn't really enjoy it that much. I think I ended up giving it 2 stars, and the reason for that is this covers Richard Hell's music career. So it starts from early life to his music career, which ended in 1984, I believe. If you're someone who's into that style of music, it is very interesting. The fact that like everybody knew each other back in the day before they were famous, like all these musical legends just all kind of running into each other now and again. But one thing that I really didn't like about this is the way he would discuss female musicians, female artists that he comes into contact with, that he's attracted to, or that he ends up having like brief relationships with. I'm trying to be like as polite as possible. I don't want to say it was degrading to women. Like, there's a certain point where he's just talking about Patti Smith's breasts, and that's just weird to me. I don't want to know about Patti Smith's titties. I don't want like these women sexualized in my mind whatsoever, but it just really came across as like a man being a man, and I just thought that was quite disappointing that he wasn't writing from a place of kind of being respectful. It didn't blow me away. It didn't captivate me the way a lot of music memoirs usually do, and ultimately I was quite disappointed with this one. So after that, I decided to go to the library to get some books out, because my library reopened and I was just very excited about it, and I picked up a couple of books which you saw me talk about in my reading vlog if you watched that. So I read Blood and Guts in High School by Kathy Acker, and she was actually referenced in the last book that I talked about as well. Hearing the title Blood and Guts in High School, I assumed it was going to be about like adolescence and how difficult it is being in high school and being a teenager, and you've got all these like hormonal changes, and you know, it's a horrible period in life for a lot of people. So I thought it was going to be like about the high school experience. It is not. It's just titled that. It's about a young girl who's 10 years old when we first encounter her, who's having a sexual relationship with her father that like ultimately kind of breaks up, and it's just about her trying to find her way in life, and it's an experimental novel. And one of the things I regret about not showing it in my reading blog is that I forgot to actually show you like the inside of the book to display what I was talking about. It's written in a really unique way, so it's kind of written as if it's a script, but then there's other moments where it's a dream map, so it's kind of like a journal. Very hard to read, very difficult to read, really disturbing subject matter, really sad as well. There's moments where cancer is referenced, and if you don't know, Kathy Acker actually passed away from cancer in the late 90s, and so seeing this talk about the fear of cancer and getting cancer was very, very sad, knowing what happened to the author later on in life. It's definitely not for everyone. Like, this isn't a book that I would be like, yeah, I really recommend it. It is a very specific taste. Like, it's very niche. So like, if you're someone who's into experimental stuff, maybe check it out, but maybe do a bit of reading about it before you actually end up reading it, because you might be quite shocked by it. The next book that I read was The Colour Purple by Alice Walker, and this is another book that I've been meaning to read for absolute years. So it's about a young woman named Celie, and the book covers the majority of her life, which is something that I wasn't really expecting. I thought it was just going to be like teens to the 20s, but it actually covers up until like her 50s or 60s or so. It's written in a letter format, so initially Celie's writing letters to God, but eventually it turns into writing letters to her sister, and her sister starts writing letters back as her sister's living off in Africa at a certain point. And I really loved the correspondence between the two. At first it was quite hard to read because there's sexual abuse on the first couple of pages, but after that, and once you get into the story of like Celie and her sister, and also like the other people who are in their life. So you've got Shug, who, it was funny, in my reading vlog I really gave out about the fact that I didn't like Shug. There would have been no character development for Celie if Shug had not been there to really get her out of her shell. So it's funny that like at the time I was so wrapped up in my own emotions of it that I didn't really see the full picture. It took me about a week or so of thinking back and being like, actually, do you know what, Shug wasn't as bad as I made her out to be in the reading vlog. It's a pretty easy one to read. Like, it's something that I would have probably been better off reading in my teens, though I don't feel like reading it now had that much of an effect on my enjoyment. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I really just thought at the end of the day, once I got through the novel, that it was a really warm, charming story. So the next book that I read was The Terror by Dan Simmons, and it wasn't very smart picking it up because it was over 900 pages, but do you know what, I loved every second of it, so it was totally worthwhile. But yeah, reading it to try to get back on track with my reading challenge wasn't probably the smartest idea, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. And to be fair, I have been lacking on my horror reading this year. There's a lot of books that I need to kind of catch up on because I'm realizing that I've only read like 1 or 2. It's been quite bad. So yeah, this is about a ship that's named Terror that gets stuck in the Antarctic, frozen in. It basically depicts what happens to the crew. They are suffering from like frostbite, malnutrition, scurvy. There is the politics that's happening within the ship, and like the pettiness and backstabbing and plotting that goes on with the characters. And on top of all that, there's also a monster that's hunting them down and picking them off one by one. And they don't know where this monster's from. They don't really know what it is. And they don't know why it's coming after them, but it's got a taste for human blood and it's just not going to stop. So it is a really gripping read. Like, it was a total binge read for me. Again, I'm going to just be repeating myself of what I said in my vlog, but it was just really nice to get through. And I think it's weird because like it is 900 pages. You'd think I would struggle with it. I think I read it in 3 days or so. I read it very, very quickly. This was just like another 4-star read for me. It was just so much fun, and it was just nice to have this weekend where I didn't have to put a lot of effort into reading. I was able just to read it and take it in. I wasn't overthinking it. I wasn't analysing it to a really huge extent. I wasn't being massively critical. Like, it's a horror book. It gave me what I needed when I read a horror book. I don't have huge expectations of horror. Like, I like some of the cringiness, the cheesiness that goes into it, and this had a little bit of that. So it just basically ticked all the boxes for me. Then finally, the last book that I read during my summer break was The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and this was interesting. And I don't mean interesting in a good way, because I had read 200 pages of this book last year. I think I read it in November of last year, and I ended up having to give my copy back to the library because there was a hold on it, so I could never finish it. So it bothered me for the majority of this year that I had an unread book or an unfinished book, because I don't like leaving books unfinished for that amount of time. So I ended up getting it out of the library again, and I decided to start fresh and start from the very beginning again, because I was a little bit iffy because so much time had passed, and I tend to read a lot of dystopian fiction. So I was like, let's just give it the benefit of the doubt and start again, and hopefully it would be a completely different reading experience. And unfortunately it kind of wasn't. I feel like for me that this is a really overhyped book. Now, I know that there are elements in it that are quite disturbing, but as a bit of a connoisseur of disturbing literature, I didn't find it disturbing enough. And there were certain things in it that were insinuated that I was expecting to happen later on in the novel that ended up not happening. There is one particular moment in this that I think if you're someone who doesn't really read a lot of dark things, it would truly shock you, because it is upsetting to read. It is gross and just horrible. But to me, I was like, okay, finally, we're getting on to the weird stuff. That was kind of like the peak of disturbing things. I didn't particularly like the ending. I didn't really like the language in it. I found it to be quite repetitive, especially the son. At first I thought he could only really say 5 different sentences because what he says is so repetitive. I was really expecting that I was going to love this book, because on paper, the plot synopsis, the themes that it explores are all the kind of things that I really like reading about, but I just feel like it fell short. I think I ended up giving it 3 stars. Like, I didn't absolutely hate it. I was very aware that my own kind of bias had interfered with my liking of the novel. So, you know, there's that. So those are all the books that I read over my summer break. Let me know if you've read any of them. Let me know what you were also reading this summer. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, because it would absolutely make my day. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.